Hi BookTube, welcome to a Sideline video. The last time you watched me review a book was 4 weeks ago, wasn't it? 31st of October. Doesn't mean I haven't been reading. November 2024 is going to go down in my records as the month of The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Coming in at 900 pages, it's dominated my reading time. I have not quite finished the book as this video is being recorded. Let me see if I've got it here. Yes. You will see less than 150 pages to read. But I've had to restrain myself really not to try and say something too early, because The Magic Mountain, it's an experience. It's a phenomenon. It's an epic, but it's an epic in disguise because it appears on the surface to be just a rather tedious tale of a rather ordinary young man visiting a clinic in Switzerland. It was one of a small group of novels published in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which made a complete break with the literary past in terms of style and content, yet making a lot of reference to the past, as if to work out what is history supposed to mean exactly to the modern person. Thomas Mann, the author, said about his own novel that it, quote, had little or nothing in common with a novel in the usual sense of the word. And that description could put a lot of people off, but speaking personally, The Magic Mountain has left me feeling a little in awe. Let's talk about how I came to know about The Magic Mountain, because the novel wasn't a completely unknown quantity to me in November 2024. No. In the early 2000s, we have to go back a quarter of a century, when I was studying world mythologies and anything connected to Hermeticism, Hermetic symbols and the tarot. And I read a lot of Joseph Campbell. Now, Campbell was an American professor of literature, but he had a really keen interest in comparative mythology and religion. He wrote a series of 4 books that looked at world mythology, and the final book in that series, Creative Mythology, The Masks of God, that considered what should the modern mind do with all this mythology? What use might it have? And it was Campbell who mentioned The Magic Mountain frequently throughout this book, enough to impress on me that someday I was going to have to read Thomas Mann. Now, I'm glad that I didn't try to read The Magic Mountain then and there. I'm glad that I waited to be a quarter of a century older. I wouldn't say that a person has to be old to read the book, but I think Thomas Mann's novel, it's going to reward the reader in proportion to how much they know and how widely they have read. It's like a bank. It's like a bank paying interest. And if you think of the interest being understanding the novel more deeply, then if you bring a bigger deposit of knowledge to the book, then I believe it pays you back more generously. Saying that, I also think it's a work that must be reread. So there is an argument for doing your first reading of The Magic Mountain early, right? Take what you can from it, and then come back again after a decade or two to find out whether you now have more to offer The Magic Mountain, and therefore it will have more to offer you. So I said in the opening clip that I consider The Magic Mountain to be epic. And by epic, I mean that it's a novel where the story is describing activity that needs a long, long time to be completed. And it's challenging in scope, whether you look at it as a whole or whether you chop it into its individual achievements, either way. And these are some of the ways, I'm going to now describe some of the ways I feel The Magic Mountain challenges its protagonist, but also its reader. And the first way is spatially. Hans Castorp is our protagonist. He's just 23 years old when the novel begins. He is an orphan. Now, how many mythological characters are orphans? The journey he takes, it's not far in terms of miles or kilometers. He goes from Hamburg in Germany up to the top of the mountains into Davos in Switzerland. It's not very far. not in terms of modern travel. Yet, it's the journey as it's described, the way the landscape changes and it seems to separate the main character. It's almost as if the effect is to cut him off completely from his previous existence. It makes it seem as though he has crossed into an alternative universe. The sanatorium at Davos, it feels so remote. I almost thought to myself it was like space travel before space travel was possible. And to add to this remoteness, there's just the strangeness of the place Hans finds himself. It's a strange environment. It's a strange atmosphere that's said to cure illness on the one hand, but also bring on illness as well. And the protagonist experiences many altered states of consciousness. So those are yet more alternative interior universes, mini quests within the larger one. And there's frequent biblical and mythological allusions, and all that just underlines the idea that this is a special kind of existence. This place, and Hans being in this place, a timeless existence, which leads perfectly into my next point. Because my next point is that the book is also temporally challenging. It describes an experience covering 7 years, and it's told over 900 pages. So you might think, aha, that means about 130 pages for every year, except that is not how this book divides up time. Not nicely, not evenly. Time distorts. The first 3 weeks of the story take 232 pages. The next 2 years, 448 pages, and the final 5 years take only 217 pages. There's a section in chapter 6 where Hans, he makes a foolish decision to go off skiing by himself in the mountains in the middle of winter, right? And he gets caught in a blizzard, or a whiteout, as my Canadian relatives would have called it on the prairies. His visibility shrinks to where he can see his hand in front of his face, but he shouldn't move it too far away. And he struggles, he wanders blindly in a direction that he thinks is taking him towards civilization. But when he finally reaches something he can touch and identify, it turns out that he's just walked in a big circle. And he checks his pocket watch, because it seems to him that he was at least an hour, if not more, wandering around, and yet his watch is telling him that in fact the whole thing only lasted 10 minutes. Now, I know that the reading of all the pages of text which described him wandering about lost, that took me more than 10 minutes to read. So always, this book is playing with your understanding of time. The first pages of chapter 7, by the way, titled By the Ocean of Time, that's actually a short essay which is looking at the uniqueness of narration as an art form, because it's the only one that can work with time in the exact way that it does. The third way that the Magic Mountain will challenge the reader as it does its main character is philosophically, politically, historically, scientifically. I suppose you could lump all that together and just say intellectually. Hans Castorp is put through, and he also puts himself through, a rigorous self-education. And he has many teachers. There are characters with very interesting names like Settembrini and Nafta and Behrens and Peppercorn. And these men don't agree with each other, by the way. Their ways of living, their instructions, and their arguments. In fact, I am not sure how many pages are taken up, for example, with the debates between Settembrini and Nafta. But if I had to guess, I would say at least 50. And if I'm right, then 5% of the Magic Mountain is the reader being trapped, just like Hans Castorp is, being trapped between two very well-read men who are trying to prove that they each know better than the other. And I have a theory. It's a rough, unproven thing, so please don't take it very seriously. But as I was reading these pages and pages of argument between these two men, and I had to reread them often to try and be sure, am I following their lines of thought? And it seemed to me that I would read a first point and understand it, read the following point and understand that. But then I would come to the third point, and I would swear, no matter how many times I reread, I would swear that the third point made absolutely no sense. And I began to wonder if Thomas Mann was being deliberate in this, if he had a rule whereby he deliberately put words in the mouths of Settembrini and Nafta that no one would be able to understand because they simply weren't understandable. I don't know, but it was comforting to know that Hans Castorp was managing about as well as I was. On page 591 of my library copy, the narrator says, "It became so hard for Hans Castorp's civilian responsibility to distinguish between opposed positions or even to keep premises apart from each other and clear in his mind." Yeah, to be able to follow these debates, by the way, between Settembrini and NAFTA, I think a reasonable working knowledge of European history is needed, particularly the history of Christianity, and also those new social and religious concepts which came along in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, which became alternatives to Christian mythology and morality. You do need that. And the final way I'm going to mention that the book challenges the reader and challenges the main character is emotionally. I've spoken, of course, in previous videos of David and his channels, his main one, Polyglot Reading, but also his channel, Thomas Mann Project, where he is analyzing and close reading the Magic Mountain. Very useful videos. If you watch them, what will become clear is that mortality and death are subjects frequently examined throughout the book. And if I might be presumptuous, I would also say undeath and the vampiric, but let's not get distracted, okay? And in the face of death, emotions, ordinary emotions, take on brighter, stranger colors and forms. So compassion, joy, lust, curiosity, fear. Hans experiences all these, and yet they somehow seem more rarefied, different than if he'd experienced the same emotions in the world that he came from, if you understand me. And also, Hans seems to have this natural inclination to inactivity, a lethargy, and it just kept reminding me of that drained feeling that you can have if you're suffering from depression or anxiety, where you just literally can do nothing for hours and hours and not notice it. And he's experienced that a great deal as well. So it's another form of rarefied emotion. And of course, all these challenges that I'm talking about, all these aspects of the book, really, we are just sweeping the surface of the novel here. I haven't even touched on the symbolic and hermetic aspects of the novel, and I bet there are aspects I haven't included because I haven't perceived them yet. I mean, certainly because I have to read the book in translation, that's an insufficiency as well. And so I'm really grateful to David for the Thomas Mann Project channel, because he's helping to make up for some of that lack. So what else can I say about reading The Magic Mountain and how it will feel, or Hans Castorp, the protagonist, of course, he's a young man. And so reading The Magic Mountain when you're young, it kind of makes sense. And it's fine, it's great, because the book definitely needs to be reread, so you'll have more time to schedule those rereads. But when you do read it, you've just got to expect to be challenged, and you've got to be ready for that. That you've got to say, yep, I want to read a book that challenges me. Because if we look at things from Hans Castorp's point of view, The Magic Mountain is this 7-year-long educational and spiritual retreat for him. And if you can imagine, what if you had 7 years where you had no demands on your time? I mean, you're not holding down a job, you don't have a family to look after, you have no domestic everyday responsibilities. You know, all you need to devote yourself to in your time awake is reading and thinking and discussing with other people what you've read and thought about. And you're right, it's hard to imagine that, because we've pretty much all had to do our learning in between doing other things. So this learning that Hans was able to give a full 7 years to, like, how long would that actually take in real life? Do you know what I mean? Would it be 30 years? Would it be 40? You know, and perhaps it's because Hans is able to concentrate this educational experience. That's what makes this book feel a bit like it sit right. It feels surreal, slightly uncanny. It's not a life experience that any of us get to have. And so I found, certainly when I was reading it, that I was always questioning whether a particular part of the novel, should I just regard it as realism, or should I take it as face value, or should I regard it as metaphor, allegory, allusion? And I can just imagine a group of really dedicated readers, how you could have a lot of discussions trying to make those decisions as you move through the book. And there are times when the text will give you a strong impression of one thing and then a strong impression of another. And I'll give you an example. Early on in the text, I began to get this feeling that maybe the sanatorium where Hans finds himself is it's just a cynical enterprise, and it's preying on gullible people by telling them they have illnesses that they do not in fact have. But then further on, when a couple of patients did decide to defy the doctor's instructions and leave, and they went out of Switzerland altogether, and they stayed away often for several months, they ended up coming back with symptoms that became fatal. And I didn't really know what to do with those contradictions. Again, that would be something for a reread. They're so, not if I reread The Magic Mountain, but when, I think what I'll do is buy a hard copy that I don't mind marking up all over the place, because I really want to annotate that text and capture some of these theories that I have. See if I can actually find what I think I'm seeing in the text in the text. And perhaps because Hans is able to concentrate so much on this educational experience, and it's so academic and it's so detailed, the book is in many places tedious and repetitious. And those aren't criticisms. I mean, they sound like it, but they're not. Hans takes an obsessive interest in various subjects during his stay, and the details he studies, they go straight onto the page for you. You have Herr Settembrini. When instructing Hans, he revisits the same concepts over and over. He's hoping to really get them into Hans's mind, and more so when Nata arrives, who is a Jesuit, and Settembrini fears that his propaganda will undo all the good work he's done with Hans. And so the same ideas come out again, but now they're weapons against Nata's arguments. I could understand if a new reader found this book just too strange, too much. No one should choose to read The Magic Mountain expecting to sit back and be entertained. There are points in the book which are entertaining, as it happens. But The Magic Mountain, it's an epic challenge, and not just for Hans Castorp, but also for the reader. And this is just my impression, but I felt that Thomas Mann would want the reader to tackle the book as a personal challenge to be met and the full achievement obtained, like a mountain to be climbed, right? It's a book where the reader's not permitted to demand anything from the text, right? It's the other way around. The text will be making demands on the reader. Of course, I don't know at this point exactly how the novel will end. I don't know whether or not I will perceive Hans as the hero of this epic. Thomas Mann has already suggested that I should keep my expectations reasonable. On page 748, the English translation refers to Hans Castorp as our unheroic hero. But if I do find Hans Castorp to be lacking, if he disappoints me or I end up with mixed feelings about him, that would satisfy me. That I could say with confidence that this is a work of modernism, a work that cannot face the truth and still believe in the triumph of ideals or the security of conventions or the unquestioning submission to authority. And that's it, everybody. Thank you for letting me share some thoughts, some bare, scratching the surface thoughts about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Having taken you up to such great literary heights, I hope it doesn't feel like a letdown in a few days' time when I review a much more ordinary work of nonfiction. But I learned something about the early days of American television programming, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when very few people owned televisions in the United States, and the networks were creating the material, not knowing what their audience would want on this new media, or even if it would grow. And I learned about 4 women. One of them you'll probably know, but the other 3, history forgot about them. And you know that I love to champion things that seem to have been neglected or forgotten. So join me on Sunday and we'll talk more. In the meantime, happy reading to everybody and take care. Bye-bye.